The orphan maiden sold pies on the road beneath the oppressive, coal-dusted drizzle of Yorkshire, her frost-bitten fingers wrapping each greasy parchment with a precision that belied her ragged skirts. Every morning, as the heavy iron gates of Oakhaven Manor groaned open to admit the coal wagons, Clara adjusted her frayed woolen shawl, stepped close to the churned mud of the carriage track, and lifted her tray of warm mince and mutton pasties to the icy wind. She knew the rhythm of the road by heart, the heavy plod of dray horses, the sharp clatter of tradesmen's carts, and, precisely at 4 o'clock, the polished, thunderous arrival of the ducal coach. It was 1888, an era when the industrial soot of Manchester bled straight into the ancient, silent estates of the northern aristocracy, creating a world divided sharply between those who starved in the mud and those who dined off gilded plate. Clara remembered nothing before the harsh, damp walls of the St. Jude foundling home, save for a recurring dream of a high painted ceiling and the smell of crushed lavender. For 7 years, she had survived in the small village bounding the Oakhaven estate, earning barely enough coppers from passing travelers to keep a roof over her head and a fire in her hearth. Yet despite the flour on her cheeks and the patched hem of her dress, there was a quiet, unyielding nobility in her posture that set her apart from the other street vendors, a dignity that no amount of poverty had managed to break. Inside the crest-emblazoned carriage sat William Cavendish, the 9th Duke of Blackwood. At 28, William was a man forged by duty, grief, and the crushing weight of a sprawling, debt-laden heritage. Returning from a grueling session in Parliament, his mind was consumed by the slow decay of his family's ancient estate and the suffocating marriage negotiations being forced upon him by his formidable aunt, the Dowager Marchioness of Devon. The nobility expected him to wed Lady Margaret, a cold heiress whose vast railroad fortune could restore the roof of Blackwood Castle. But William's heart remained anchored 15 years in the past, bound to the memory of a tragedy that had shattered his youth. The sudden, mysterious disappearance of Lady Clara Montgomery, the daughter of his father's closest ally, to whom William had been betrothed since childhood. As the carriage slowed to navigate the steep, slick turn near the manor's northern boundary, the horses reared slightly, startled by a stray dog. The vehicle lurched to a halt with a screech of iron wheels against cobblestone. William brushed back the velvet curtain of his window to inspect the delay, his dark eyes weary and distant. That was the moment their worlds collided. Clara had stepped back to avoid the splashing mud, raising her lantern to illuminate the dark slope. The golden light struck her face directly, cutting through the twilight. William's gaze drifted casually toward the roadside vendor, and froze. The breath caught in his throat, a sharp, suffocating gasp that rattled his chest. There, standing in the slurry of rain and horse manure, holding a wooden tray of cheap pies, was a face he had memorized in childhood portraits and mourned for half his life. But it was not merely the high cheekbones or the gentle curve of her jaw that struck him like a physical blow. It was her eyes. They were a rare, striking shade of deep violet gray, flecked with gold around the pupils. Eyes that belonged to only one bloodline in all of Great Britain. "Stop the coach," William commanded, his voice barely a whisper, yet laced with an authority so absolute that the footman jumped down before the wheels had even ceased turning. William threw open the heavy carriage door, stepping straight into the freezing slush, without a thought for his polished leather boots or his tailored wool coat. He strode toward her, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead, his heartbeat hammering violently against his ribs like a trapped bird. Clara shrank back slightly, her knuckles whitening around the edge of her tray as the tall, imposing nobleman approached. She knew who he was, of course. Every peasant within 50 miles knew the stern, beautiful Duke of Blackwood, whose dark eyes rarely deigned to look upon the common folk. "My lord," Clara stammered, her voice soft, carrying a delicate melodic cadence that seemed entirely out of place amidst the coarse northern accents of the marketplace. Would you care for a pasty?" "They are fresh, sir. Only 2 pence. William stopped less than 2 feet from her. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. The scar beneath her left collarbone, barely visible above the faded neckline of her dress, mirrored the mark left by a childhood riding accident he had witnessed himself. His hands trembled as he reached out, his gloved fingers hovering just inches from her face, desperate to touch her, yet terrified that she might vanish like a phantom born of his relentless grief. "Clara?" he whispered, the name tearing from his throat, heavy with 15 years of unanswered prayers. Clara frowned, a ripple of confusion crossing her brow as she looked up into his intense, searching gaze. "My name is Clara, my lord. But I am no lady. I am merely Clara of the parish. You must have confused me with someone else." "No," William said, his voice raw with an emotion that shocked even himself. He looked into those violet eyes, searching the depths of her soul, finding the lost girl who had once played in the rose gardens of Blackwood Castle. "I would know those eyes anywhere in this kingdom. You are Lady Clara Montgomery. You are the lost daughter of the Earl of Ravenhurst, and my betrothed." A sudden, sharp gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of tradesmen and servants who had paused to witness the spectacle. Clara stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind reeling in disbelief. A lady? An earl's daughter? It was madness. She was a girl who scrubbed floors and sold pastry scraps to survive the winter. Before she could speak, a second carriage bearing the Blackwood crest pulled up behind the Dukes. The door snapped open, and Lady Margaret stepped out shielded by a servant's umbrella. Her eyes narrowed in cold disdain as she took in the scene. The Duke of Blackwood standing in the mud, staring with unbridled passion at a filthy pie vendor. "William!" Lady Margaret's sharp voice sliced through the damp air. "What is the meaning of this spectacle? You are making a scene in front of the villagers." William did not look back. He kept his eyes locked on Clara, stepping closer, reaching out to gently touch the edge of her wet shawl. "Come with me, Clara. You do not belong in the mud. You never did." Clara looked at the majestic Duke, then at the sneering noblewoman, and finally down at her own trembling, mud-stained hands. A sudden, terrifying wave of realization washed over her. If this man spoke the truth, then her entire life had been a lie. But as she opened her mouth to answer, a dark figure watching from the shadowed edge of the estate's tree line silently slipped away into the fog. A man wearing the livery of the late Earl of Ravenhurst, carrying a concealed pistol beneath his heavy coat. "I cannot go with you, my lord," Clara whispered, stepping backward toward the edge of the embankment. "If I am who you say I am, then the people who stole my life are still watching." As she took that backward step, the rain-soaked earth beneath her boots gave way, sending her slipping toward the raging, swollen waters of the ravine below. William did not hesitate. As the muddy embankment gave way, sending Clara sliding toward the dark, rushing waters of the swollen ravine, he lunged forward. His gloved hand lashed out, catching the frayed wool of her shawl, but the fabric ripped violently under her weight. With a desperate surge of strength, he threw his body over the rim of the slope, his fingers wrapping firmly around her bare wrist. The cold water dragged at her heavy skirts, the current pulling with vicious force. But William planted his boots into an exposed oak root, his muscles straining against the pull. "I have you!" he roared above the rush of the river, his dark eyes locked onto hers with a fierce, unwavering desperation. "Do not let go, Clara." With a brutal pull, he dragged her up the muddy incline, pulling her trembling, soaked body against his chest as they both collapsed onto the rain-slick grass. Clara lay gasping for air, her pulse hammering in her ears, her forehead pressed against the fine, damp wool of his coat. She could feel the rapid, violent thrum of his heart beating against her cheek, a rhythm that felt terrifyingly alive, bound to her own frantic breath. "Get the carriage ready, immediately," William ordered, his voice echoing across the hillside like a thunderclap, brooking no argument from the stunned servants. He lifted Clara into his arms as if she weighed nothing, ignoring the gasps of the gathered crowd and the sharp, furious protest of Lady Margaret, who stood beneath her umbrella, her face pale with indignation. "William, this is madness," Margaret cried, her boots ruined by the pooling mud as she took a step toward them. "You are parading a common street vendor into your home. Think of the scandal. Think of your family's name." William paused, turning a gaze upon her so icy and commanding that Margaret instinctively recoiled. If she is who I know her to be, Margaret, her name carries more ancient honor than any title in this county. And even if she were a beggar, I would not leave her to drown. Without another word, he carried Clara into the warm, velvet-lined interior of his private carriage, wrapping her shivering shoulders in his own fur-lined cloak. The door slammed shut, cutting off the cold wind and the stares of the world outside. As the carriage lurked forward toward Oakhaven Manor, Clara huddled into the vast warmth of the heavy cloak, staring at the man sitting opposite her. The Duke of Blackwood was a commanding presence, his jaw set in a hard, noble line, his dark eyes watching her every breath with a mixture of reverence and profound sorrow. "Who am I?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling, her hands clutching the embroidered velvet of the cloak. "If I am not Clara of St. Jude's, who was I before the orphanage?" William leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, bringing himself closer to her. The golden light of the carriage lantern illuminated the sharp angles of his face. "You are Lady Clara Montgomery, sole heiress to the Earldom of Ravenhurst. 15 years ago, your father's carriage was ambushed on the road between York and London. The vehicle was found overturned in a river, your parents dead, and you vanished. The authorities believed you had drowned, your body swept away by the current." He paused, his chest heaving as he reached into his breast pocket, pulling out a small, tarnished silver locket attached to a delicate chain. He extended it toward her. "Your father gave this to my father on the day our betrothal was sealed. Inside is a portrait of your mother." Clara took the silver token with trembling fingers. Her thumb brushed the worn metal, finding a hidden latch. It clicked open. Inside was a tiny, exquisite miniature painting of a woman with high cheekbones, dark hair, and the exact same violet-gray eyes that looked back at Clara every morning in her cracked mirror. A sudden, overwhelming tear spilled over Clara's lashes, hot against her cold cheek. The foggy memories of her childhood, the painted ceiling, the smell of crushed lavender, floated to the surface, no longer a fragment of a dream, but a forgotten reality. "They told me I was abandoned on the chapel steps," she breathed, the weight of a stolen life crushing down upon her chest. "I suffered for 15 years, scrubbing floors, starving in winter. And you will never suffer again," William said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he had buried for over a decade. He gently reached out, his bare fingers brushing away the tear on her cheek. The touch sent a jolt of electric warmth through Clara's veins, a sudden, breath-stealing tension that lingered between them in the quiet carriage. "I swear it on my life, Clara." By nightfall, Oakhaven Manor was ablaze with whispered rumors. The Duke had brought a street vendor into the grand estate, housing her in the opulent Rose Suite, ordering the housemaids to prepare hot baths, French soaps, and silk gowns. The Dowager Marchioness of Devon, William's formidable aunt, paced the marble halls of the gallery, her silk skirts rustling like dry leaves. "It is an outrage, William," the Dowager declared as William entered the drawing room, having changed into clean evening attire. She stood by the grand fireplace, her withered hands clutching her ivory walking stick. "The girl is an imposter, a clever thief trying to entrap a duke. Lady Margaret's father has already threatened to withdraw his financial backing from the estate if this insult is not corrected." "She has the Ravenhurst eyes, Aunt," William replied calmly, pouring himself a glass of amber brandy. "And she carries the scar from the fall off her pony at Blackwood Castle when she was 7. I was there. I remember. Scars can be faked. Eyes are a coincidence," the Marchioness snapped. "Even if she were the lost Montgomery girl, 15 years in the gutter has ruined her for high society. She knows nothing of protocol, of speech, of managing an estate. She will destroy what little dignity this house has left." "She is my betrothed," William said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register that made his aunt freeze. "The contract signed by my late father and the Earl of Ravenhurst remains legally binding. Until proven otherwise, She is the rightful owner of the Ravenhurst fortune, a fortune that dwarfs even the railway empire of Margaret's father. Meanwhile, upstairs in the lavish bedchamber, Clara sat before a vanity mirror, wrapped in a heavy velvet dressing gown. The warm water had washed away the grime of the road, but she felt more out of place here among the gilded mirrors and crystal sconces than she ever had in her cramped cottage. A quiet knock at the door startled her. William entered, carrying a small silver tray with tea and delicate biscuits. He motioned for the maid to leave, closing the door softly behind her. "You should be resting," he said gently, placing the tray on the mahogany table beside her. "I cannot sleep," Clara admitted, looking up at him through her lashes. The contrast between them was striking. He, the quintessential aristocrat in his tailored black coat, and she, a trespasser in a world of wealth. "My lord, William, if I am this lady, what happens now? I do not know how to hold a fan, let alone converse with marchionesses. They look at me as if I am mud on their rugs." William walked over to her, stopping behind her chair. In the mirror, their eyes met. "You do not need to please them, Clara. You only need to be yourself. The grace you carried on that muddy road was greater than any lady in London possesses." The sincerity in his voice struck her deeply. For years, Clara had known only coldness, suspicion, and the transactional cruelty of survival. To have this powerful, magnificent man look at her not with pity, but with profound respect and a growing, unmistakable tenderness, made her heart flutter wildly. "Why do you care so much?" she asked quietly, turning in her chair to face him. "Is it merely the honor of an ancient contract?" William stepped closer, his dark eyes softening as he looked down at her. "When you vanished, a part of my life died with you. I grew up in a world of fake smiles and cold ambition. You were the last genuine memory of my youth. Finding you. It feels as though the sun has finally returned after 15 years of winter." He reached down, taking her hand gently in his. Clara felt the warmth of his skin, the strength in his fingers, and for a moment, the vast chasm of their social classes dissolved entirely. The space between them grew heavy with a quiet, suffocating passion, a magnetic pull that drew them closer until their breath mingled in the soft light of the fireplace. "William," she whispered, her heart pounding against her ribs. Before he could answer, the heavy oak door was thrown open without warning. The Dowager Marchioness stood on the threshold, flanked by two elderly men in dark coats, the estate's senior solicitors. "Forgive the intrusion, William," the Marchioness said, her voice dripping with cold triumph. "But if this girl wishes to claim the Ravenhurst name and estate, she must submit to legal verification, and it seems there is a grave complication." One of the solicitors stepped forward, opening a thick leather ledger. "My lord, if Lady Clara Montgomery is indeed alive, the Ravenhurst estate does not pass to her automatically. According to the late Earl's revised will, drafted weeks before his death, if no direct male heir claimed the title within 15 years, the entire fortune and the land revert entirely to his cousin, Lord Richard Montgomery." William's expression hardened instantly. "Richard Montgomery? The man who vanished to the continent days after the accident?" "He has returned, my lord," the solicitor announced, stepping aside. A tall, lean man with sharp, fox-like features and a thin mustache stepped into the doorway, wearing a cloak damp with rain. His eyes swept over Clara with a chilling, predatory smirk. "Ah, my dear little niece," Lord Richard purred, stepping into the room. "How remarkable that you should suddenly reappear. Just 3 days before the 15-year deadline expires, when the Ravenhurst title becomes mine forever." Clara stood up, her pulse racing as a sudden, terrifying memory flickered in her mind. The sound of gunshot, the smell of gunpowder mixed with wet earth, and a man's face shadowed by a dark cloak standing over her parents' broken carriage. It was the face of the man now standing before her. "It was you," Clara gasped, her voice barely a whisper, as the horrifying realization struck her like a physical blow. "You were there that night, Clara's accusation echoed through the ornate ceiling of the Rose Suite like the crack of a whip. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of embers in the marble hearth and the distant whisper of rain against the sash windows. Lord Richard Montgomery did not flinch. A short, icy laugh escaped his thin lips as he stepped forward, adjusting his black kidskin gloves with calculated calm. An extraordinary accusation from a girl who, until a few hours ago, was selling pies in the Yorkshire mud, he said, his voice dripping with velvety poison. Terror, cold, and the deprivation of misery have clearly unhinged your mind, my dear niece. Or should we call this a remarkably well-rehearsed swindle? I remember your face, Clara insisted, taking a firm step forward despite the tremor in her hands. The presence of William beside her, an imposing shadow of protection, gave her a courage she never knew she possessed. There was mist that night, and the smell of gunpowder. I was hiding in the thicket beside the overturned carriage. You held a dueling pistol with the Montgomery crest engraved on the butt. You looked at me before your servant dragged me away. Enough of this madness, the Dowager Marchioness intervened, striking her ivory cane sharply against the oak floorboards. William, you cannot allow this beggar to slander a nobleman of Lord Richard's standing in the heart of your own home. This is insanity. William did not take his eyes off Richard. The Duke of Blackwood took a slow, menacing step toward the older man, his jaw set in iron rigidity. If there is a single grain of truth in Clara's words, Richard, I swear on my family's honor that you will end your days in the darkest cell of Newgate. Empty threats, Your Grace, Richard replied with a disdainful smirk, pulling a sealed document with red wax from his coat. The courts of London do not judge based on the confused memories of traumatized orphans. They judge on laws and papers. This is the original will of my late cousin, duly registered with the Chancery. Unless this young woman can prove her identity before the Crown Council by midnight on Friday, exactly 15 years after the accident, the title, the lands, and the entire Ravenhurst fortune pass irrevocably to me. Richard turned on his heel, but paused at the threshold, glancing back at Clara over his shoulder. By the way, Your Grace, I heard that your father's creditors are pressing for the liquidation of Blackwood Castle's debts. It would be a terrible pity if such an unwise marital choice led the Cavendish family to total ruin before the end of the month. When the door closed and the Marchioness swept out in indignation, accompanied by the solicitors, the room plunged into a suffocating tension. Clara turned to William, the weight of reality crushing any flicker of hope that had begun to bloom in her chest. The debt, Clara whispered, covering her face with her hands. He told the truth. You need Lady Margaret's money to save your castle, your family, your legacy. If you ally yourself with me, an heir without proof, tainted by scandal and hunted by a killer, you will lose everything. William walked over to her, his strong, warm hands wrapping around her wrists, to gently pull her hands away from her face. The intensity of his gaze made Clara's heart skip a beat. Let the castle crumble to dust, Clara, he said, his voice husky and filled with a raw passion she had never heard in a nobleman. I spent 15 years living in a cage of duty and expectation, pretending this title was all that mattered. I will not lose you a second time for gold coins or the contempt of a hypocritical society. The proximity between them grew overwhelming. The heat of the fireplace felt pale compared to the flame ignited between them. For an eternal second, time stopped. William leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a hesitant touch, filled with an ancient promise and a desire held back for years. Clara sighed against his mouth, surrendering to that feeling of safety and belonging she had never known in her life. However, Victorian reality did not permit such idols for long. Over the next 48 hours, Oakhaven Manor turned into a silent battlefield. William dispatched his most trusted investigators to London and the surrounding villages to find the housekeeper who had cared for Clara as a child, the only living witness capable of confirming the scar and the baptismal certificate hidden away. Meanwhile, the scandal leaked to the high society gossip columns. The Mayfair Gazettes covered the affair with sensationalist headlines. The Duke and the Pie Girl. Miraculous heiress or the Victorian era's greatest fraud. On Thursday night, the eve of the deadline, a tense dinner was hosted in the grand dining room of Oakhaven. The air was thick with the scent of expensive roasts, beeswax, and veiled animosity. Lady Margaret and her father, the wealthy coal baron, were present, determined to press William into signing the marriage contract before the scandal destroyed both families' reputations. "If you do not announce your engagement to my daughter by tomorrow morning, Blackwood," the baron declared, cutting his roast beef forcefully, "I will purchase all your promissory notes from the London bank and demand immediate payment. You will be bankrupt by sunset." Clara, dressed in a somber dark blue silk gown provided by the maids, beautiful yet visibly out of place at the monumental table, raised her head. "You do not need to destroy him, Baron. If my presence is the cause of William's ruin, I will leave tonight." "You are going nowhere," William said, his voice razor-sharp as he stared at the Baron. "I would rather lose every stone of Blackwood than sell my soul for your money." The argument was cut short by the muffled sound of horse hooves outside and the bang of the heavy front door opening. Seconds later, the senior butler entered the dining room, pale as a corpse, holding a small wooden box eaten by moisture and coated in dried mud. "Your Grace," the butler said, his voice trembling. "A peasant just brought this from the old Montgomery estate in Kent. It was found buried beneath the roots of the old oak tree in the garden, inside an iron chest." William stood up immediately, taking the box. With a small silver tool, he forced the rusted hinge. Inside, wrapped in moldy velvet, rested a leather-bound diary bearing the late Earl of Ravenhurst's monogram, and a second will, dated the very day of the fatal accident. Clara approached, her heart beating in her throat. William flipped through the yellowed pages to the final entry. Her father's handwriting was frantically rushed, stained with ink. "If anything happens to me on this journey to London, let the world know the truth. My cousin Richard discovered the fraud in the family ledgers and stole thousands of pounds. He threatened my life. If my beloved Clara survives, the inheritance is irrevocably hers, protected by an unconditional clause kept in the royal vault at Windsor. I leave the guardianship of my daughter and her estate under the exclusive care of the Duke of Blackwood." A collective gasp echoed through the room. The definitive proof was there. Clara was not only the heiress, Richard was officially exposed as a blackmailer and murder suspect. "This changes everything," William declared, his eyes gleaming with impending victory. "Tomorrow at noon, we present this diary to the magistrate in York and clear your name forever, Clara." But the triumph was short-lived. Later that night, when the manor had sunk into the silence of early morning and the blizzard began covering the Yorkshire gardens in a white, deadly blanket, Clara was awakened by the acrid smell of smoke. She sat up abruptly, her heart racing. Opening the door of the Rose Suite, she was met by a thick gray haze filling the corridor. Orange flames were already licking the Gobelin tapestries of the East Wing. She ran toward William's study, where the diary was secured in the wall safe. But as she rounded the corner of the portrait gallery, a hand wearing a black kidskin glove clamped tightly over her mouth, while an iron arm wrapped around her waist, dragging her toward the abandoned servants' stairs. "You should have taken the coppers and stayed in the mud, my dear niece," Lord Richard's cold voice whispered in her ear, his breath smelling of brandy and vengeance. "The diary is already burning in the ashes of the library. And now, you will share the same fate your parents met on that rainy night." Clara fought desperately, digging her heels into the stone steps, while above them, the centuries-old wooden ceiling began to groan and crack with a fatal roar. The deafening heat of the inferno consumed the east wing of Oakhaven Manor, reducing the lavish oak woodwork to a nightmare of roaring flames and suffocating charcoal smoke. Richard dragged Clara down the steep, narrow steps toward the stone cellars beneath the estate, where the damp subterranean air was freezing and the thick masonry muffled the sound of her frantic, muffled cries. Clara, feeling the oxygen fading from her lungs, summoned every ounce of resilience forged during her years on the harsh roads of Yorkshire. She clamped her teeth down violently onto the unloved hand covering her mouth. Richard let out a sharp howl of rage and pain, stumbling backward against the damp wall. Clara broke free, but before she could take 2 steps into the gloom of the cellar, he lunged, grabbing her by her hair and hurling her onto the dirt floor. The brass lantern he carried crashed down beside her, shattering and spreading a pool of burning oil across the flagstones. "You miserable little street rat," Richard snarled, drawing the heavy double-barreled pistol from beneath his heavy coat. "I spent 15 years waiting for this title. I will not let a pie vendor raised in filth strip me of the Montgomery fortune." "You murdered my parents," Clara cried out, pulling herself up and standing tall with the inviolable dignity that neither hunger nor mud had ever managed to break. Her violet gray eyes flashed in the dark, reflecting the fire creeping down the straw-lined walls of the vault. "And even if you kill me here, William knows the truth. The entire world will know you are a murderer. The Duke will be far too busy trying to save his own burning castle to care," Richard sneered, pulling back the hammer of the gun with a lethal metallic click. "Not anymore, Richard." William's voice cut through the dark like a thunderclap. Before Richard could turn the barrel of the pistol, the imposing frame of the Duke of Blackwood charged through the haze of smoke. William hurled his entire weight against the traitor. The impact was devastating. The gun fired wildly into the vaulted ceiling, the deafening shot sending stone splinters showering down as both men slammed onto the hard ground. Richard wildly lashed out with a hidden boot dagger, but the Duke, driven by an unyielding desire to protect the woman he loved, parried the blade and disarmed the older man with a decisive, crushing blow to the jaw. William pinned Richard to the floor, holding his knee firmly against the traitor's chest until the frantic shouts of the estate servants and the county constable, who had just arrived after seeing the flames, echoed down the stone stairs. "Seize this man," William ordered the officers, his chest heaving as they dragged the ruined Lord Richard to his feet and snapped the iron manacles onto his wrists. "He stands accused of the murder of the Earl of Ravenhurst and the attempted murder of the rightful Montgomery heiress." Free from danger, William turned to Clara. Ignorant of the soot marring his face and the fire brigade working tirelessly in the courtyard above, he pulled her into his arms. He held her against his chest so tightly that Clara could feel every frantic, erratic beat of his heart. "Are you unharmed?" He breathed against her hair, his voice raw with relief and lingering terror. "Tell me you are safe." "I am safe, because you came for me," Clara whispered, burying her face into the crook of his neck as tears finally washed clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. 3 months later, the spring of 1889 bloomed across Yorkshire in a glorious carpet of yellow daffodils and fresh greenery. The fire at Oakhaven Manor had been extinguished before reaching the main halls, and the truth of the conspiracy had been laid bare in the high courts of London. Lord Richard Montgomery was sentenced to penal servitude for life in the colonies, and the official records preserved in the royal vault at Windsor irrevocably confirmed Clara's bloodline. On a radiant May morning, York Minster stood adorned with thousands of white lilies and cream roses. The finest members of the British aristocracy filled the pews, including the Dowager Marchioness, who now wore an insufferably proud smile, claiming to all who would listen that she had championed Clara from the very beginning. Lady Margaret and her father had quietly departed for the continent, unable to face the social ruin brought on by their exposed financial blackmail. Clara walked down the marble aisle of the cathedral in a breathtaking bridal gown of ivory silk, draped in delicate Honiton lace and crowned with a tiara of diamonds and violet sapphires that had once belonged to her mother. She was no longer the ragged orphan of the roadside. She was Lady Clara Montgomery, the Countess of Ravenhurst by right of birth. Yet, as her eyes met William's waiting at the altar, titles and fortunes vanished. There was only the man who had plunged into a freezing river to save her life, and the woman who had restored his lost soul. The bishop pronounced them husband and wife under the blessings of church and crown. When William leaned in and sealed their vows with a tender, unhurried kiss before the assembled peerage of England, a wave of elegant applause filled the ancient stone arches. Late that afternoon, the ducal carriage, emblazoned with the newly joined crests of Cavendish and Montgomery, paused at the crest of the hill overlooking the gates of the estate. The setting sun cast a golden, purple glow across the rolling northern hills. William stepped out first, and extended his hand to Clara. She stepped down onto the soft grass, looking across the valley where, months ago, she had sold pastries in the freezing rain just to survive. "What are you thinking, my Duchess?" William asked gently, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin softly against her shoulder. Clara placed her hands over his, hands that had known bitter cold, hard labor, and rejection, but now held the key to a noble legacy. She smiled, feeling a profound, unshakable peace settle over her heart. "I was thinking that mud may cover a diamond for years, William, but it can never alter what it is underneath," she said, turning in his embrace to look into the dark eyes of the man she loved. "True nobility does not rest in the titles carved into parchment or the gold in our vaults, but in the courage to love without fear and the honor with which we choose to protect those the world has forgotten." And there, beneath the radiant skies of Yorkshire, the Duke and his lost heiress sealed there forever, knowing that no storm in the Victorian realm could ever dim the light they had found in one another.